Okay. So this is a talk that I actually did in person at Bell House a few months ago, when we were able to do things like that, when we were able to meet up, and we thought it would be useful to be able to reach a bigger audience for those of you that couldn't be there in person, to do it online. And so I'm going to be spending the next 40 minutes taking you through what are executive functions and the cogs behind cognition. And as you've already heard, so I'm one of the founders of the Connections in Mind Foundation. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the foundation in a minute. But first of all, I'm just going to start off with what is executive functioning. Now, I'm assuming if you've turned up to this talk, you already have some awareness or some interest in it. But let's just take a look at this definition together for a moment. Sorry, I'm just jumping ahead on the slides. So executive functioning is an umbrella term to describe a set of cognitive processes that enable people to filter distractions, prioritize tasks, set and achieve goals, and control impulses. Now, the first time I read that definition, I was working as a youth worker in Camberwell in Southwark, which is where Bell House is located, in Southwark. And I was doing my best to support young people to make the transition from being kind of 16 on to, in particularly looking at like where they were going next, whether that was further education or an apprenticeship. And I was really acutely aware of lots of the difficult challenges that they faced in life, like poverty, overcrowded accommodation, relationship challenges, a whole mixture of different things. But on a daily practical level, when I read this definition, and somebody sent me a 2-page document from the Harvard School for the Developing Child, so I thought, wow, that's a pretty reputable place, they must know what they're talking about. And I read it, and it just kind of blew my mind, because it described to me so succinctly the challenges lots of the young people that I was working with faced, and it gave me a roadmap for what I could actually do about that in my work. And I don't know if you've ever felt this, but there's been kind of different points in my career where I've had like kind of light bulb moments where I've been like, oh, that's a good idea, that's something that I need to know more about. And executive function skills was one of those, because I went on to read that if we struggle with these things and it is not fixed, we're going to be looking at that in more detail. It's not like you are born with the capacity to do these things and that's it and you can't change it. They absolutely are malleable. But what I went on to learn about was how they are shaped by our environment and what we are exposed to and what we are not exposed to. And they are really important for how well we do in life. And when I say well, I mean how well we do academically. It also impacts on our mental health. It also impacts on our relationships and our work. So it seemed to me that if we knew that, then shouldn't we be doing more to make sure that young people were equipped with the support to develop strong executive function skills? So that's where I was coming from. And now let's move on and let me tell you a bit about the foundation. So kind of wind on, I don't know exactly how many years, about 12 years. And I now run this organization called the Connections in Mind Foundation. And our aims and objectives are to increase awareness of executive function skills across the population. So what I really want is that more people have that kind of a aha moment, whether that's about themselves or their children or the children and people they work with. And we offer support to children who struggle with executive function skills. We train teachers and parents, and we have a particular focus on working with families from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. And our vision is a world where executive function challenges are no longer a precursor for poor self-esteem and underachievement. Because as I go on to the talk, I hope what will become clear to you is that, unfortunately, for many people, I think they really do face discrimination because they do struggle with some skills. So the history of it was that after working as a youth worker, I then went on to become a psychologist. And along the way, I met Bettina Honan, who's a clinical psychologist, and Victoria Bagnall, who's a teacher. And they, in their own professions, had also had similar moments where they'd gone, wait a minute, this seems pretty integral to the work that we're trying to do. Why aren't more people talking about it? And interestingly, in the US, there's far more awareness of what executive function skills are and what can be done to support people to develop them. So we felt there was a gap. Sorry, I'm having some jumping around issues with my PowerPoint. I hope I don't make you all feel dizzy, but bear with me. And really the way that we operate is we want parents to have this information, so that's, you can see that group there. We work one-to-one with children, but also in schools. And the reason we think that's so important is because if you just have one aspect of that model, what can happen, for example, is we work with a child, we really help them to see, for example, that it's not that they're stupid, far from it, that perhaps just one aspect of their cognition is something that they struggle with, and that there's very much things that they can do. And if we're giving them that positive message, but they're not hearing that at home, or they're not hearing that in the classroom, or equally they're hearing it at home but not at school, then we think it's limited what we can achieve. So that's where we're coming from. So let's, before we dive into executive function skills, just cover the basics of how the brain learns and develops. So up until the last few decades, we had to rely on a couple of ways, other than being able to actually see inside brains when people were alive, to understand what was going on. So we could do things like, and I'm sorry for those of you that are a bit squeamish, but we could wait until people had died, and then we could dissect brains, and we could take them apart, and we could look at how they change. We could compare baby brains or child brains or less mature brains to adult brains. We could look at people who'd had dementia, for example, and look at how their brains had changed in its physiology. What we are now able to do is to do things like put people inside machines like fMRI machines. Some of you might have heard of functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we can expose people to different experiences. For example, I could put you in a machine now, like that, and I could show you some scary images, and then I could look at where the blood flows on your brain, and then I would be able to draw conclusions. So I'd be able to say, well, there seems to be a relationship between the specific thing I'm asking you to do, the task or the experience I'm exposing you to, and a particular part of the brain where there seems like there's a lot of activity. Now, the other thing that, sorry, just to go back, that has been really important, particularly for thinking about executive functioning, is that there's also a very famous story about somebody called Phineas Gage, who was a man that was living in America in the 1840s, and he unfortunately had a very bad day at work, so he ended up with a rod through his prefrontal cortex. Now, the other way, remember I said there was two ways that we were able to try and understand what the relationship was between brain functioning and behavior. We could also observe brains, we could observe people's behavior after they'd had brain injuries. So in Phineas's case, he ended up with a rod through his prefrontal cortex. Now, unfortunately for him, after it was removed, he in some ways had healed, so quite physically his eye had healed over, but what people observed was that his behavior was very different. So he struggled with things like response inhibition. So before the injury, he was able to control what he thought, not say the first thing that came into his mind. After the injury to his prefrontal cortex, so just above his eyes, he would say rude things, he would say inappropriate things to people. He was also no longer able to manage his time. Previously, he'd been a manager on the railways building them. He couldn't kind of think through plans and think through the sequence of steps. So psychologists and psychiatrists and scientists at the time, similar to when we open up a brain, they actually were able to draw conclusions by going, right, he's injured this part of his brain, he's now struggling with this behavior. That part of the brain must be connected to our ability to control our impulses and to plan and use our time. So I've told you a bit about how we can observe what's going on in the brain and how it's connected to behavior. We're now just going to look at the basics of something called neuroplasticity, which is key for when we're thinking about executive function skills. Because remember I said at the beginning of the talk, they're not fixed, they are malleable. So the brain has two hemispheres, there's two sides. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing an image as we look down on the brain. Now, a baby is born with billions of these things called neurons in their brain. So you can see a neuron in the bottom left-hand corner. It is not that if we compare a baby brain to a mature brain or an elderly brain, that there's just loads more neurons. The difference is that the neurons have come together to form something called synaptic pathways. So if you look at that neuron in the bottom left-hand corner, I want you now to imagine a baby that is doing something for the first time. So let's just say they are getting up and walking for the first time. The first time they figure out how to put one foot in front of the other, new pathways form in the brain that connect the different parts of the brain associated with the experience of walking. So if you think about what's going on when a baby is walking for the first time, and I'm witnessing this at the moment with my son, so there is probably, you know, they can feel as they walk along what it feels like to move one foot in front of the other. They can feel perhaps the texture of their shoes. They can feel the pressure. Perhaps they're also getting some positive feedback from parents around them. Maybe people are saying walking, so they're also connecting, so there's auditory processing as well. There is so much going on. Now, when we are exposed to new experiences, what happens is those billions of neurons in our brain connect to form pathways. And what neuroscience has basically shown us and told us is something that we've kind of known intuitively for a long time. So you've probably heard practice makes perfect. We now know what's happening in order for us to perfect things is that the gel, so if you look at that neuron in the bottom left-hand corner, you see the green body of the neuron. There is some gel that forms along the body of the neuron. Now, the more that you repeat things, the thicker the gel becomes. And this is a process called myelinization. Now, the brain is basically a big electrical circuit. And essentially, the more we repeat actions, the stronger the pathways become, because the stronger the gel becomes, and we are able to do things more quickly, more efficiently, and we know how to do them. Oh, somebody's done a little drawing on my slide. Maybe that was me. Somebody's perhaps doing a live action drawing of a synaptic pathway there. We can see getting thicker and thicker and thicker. Now, oh, it's gone. So what that in many ways represents, thank you very much, whoever did that, is a process called pruning. So the brain also does something amazing. Basically, I mean, it does many amazing things, but what we've come to learn is that, so imagine you've got these 86 billion neurons in the brain, they're all connecting. We think each neuron has about 10,000 different connections. I mean, it's mind-boggling. You can't even begin to visually imagine it. But at certain points, what the brain starts to do is it trims away the connections, which seemingly we don't need. Now, you kind of think, well, why would it do that? Why would it invest so much time in creating these synaptic pathways, building up the gel, and then prune them away? What we think it's doing is it's investing in the pathways that are really needed and making them more efficient. Now, this is really important for thinking about executive function skills, is because what it tells us is that the more we repeat these skills, the better we become at them. So let's move on. The key messages I want you to take away are that anything a child or you does changes his or her brain, and things she or he does frequently make lasting changes. And we see that in the brains. For example, there's a very famous study that looks at the brains of black cab drivers. And for those of you that are joining internationally, you may not be aware of this, but in London we have, prior to the world of Uber drivers, we mainly had black cab drivers. So that's the kind of iconic black taxi. And there was a study that looked at the brains of black cab drivers and then compared them to the rest of the population. Now, the thing that's really special about black cab drivers is that in order to officially become part of the club and get your official black cab London license, you have to have done something called the knowledge, where you spend 3 years learning all the roads in London, and then you have kind of the hardest driving test of your life, because at the end you have to sit in next to the instructor and they say to you, right, I want you to drive from, say, Hackney all the way to Battersea, so those are other sides of the city for those of you that are not from London, but you're not allowed to use a GPS or look at any maps, and they have to do it in the most efficient way possible. So they need to have learned all of those roads off by heart. Now, what they have found is that the brains of black cab driver, the part of the brain associated with spatial awareness, is bigger compared to the rest of us. And we know that this is because of neuroplasticity in action. If you spend enough time doing something again and again and again, it starts to make physiological changes to your brain. So the term we use is brain plasticity, and it means the brain is a highly adaptable organ, particularly during childhood. So let's just take, we're going to watch a video now. Oh, are we going to watch a video? No, we're not. Oh, maybe I've got the, my computer is doing that thing where it's feeling like it's overwhelmed by the video. So let's see what happens. In the meantime, I will speak to this. So we're going to watch a video in live time, watching a neural pathway form. But it seems to be taking its time. So while we're doing that, so I'm now going to model to you how you use your executive function skills in reality every day. So one of the executive function skills you have to use is something called cognitive flexibility. So it's your ability to switch from one situation to another. So for example, the person who struggles with this would be the person who has a plan with their PowerPoint presentation, but then their computer crashes and they have to think on their feet and come up with a new plan, right? So if you were struggling with your cognitive flexibility, you would find that very difficult. In terms of a child, that might be a child who has to switch from one, oh, there we go. Let's just ignore that a moment. So I'm going to stop sharing because I don't also want you to all witness my very messy computer when I'm giving you a talk all about how to organize your cognition. So I'm going to keep speaking while I'm just sorting this out, this PowerPoint presentation, which has decided to crash. So a child that struggled with cognitive flexibility, so that is one of the executive function skills, which is a critical part of the way the prefrontal cortex works, would find it really difficult, for example, to move from one class to another. So they've got to pack up their bag very quickly and go, right, I've got to go from maths and then I've got to go to PE. And some people can really manage that transition, very, very well, whereas another person will find it very, very difficult to do that. And we now know, research has shown us there are good cognitive reasons why. Now, there's also something called, well, you guys will be familiar with this concept, emotional control. Now, emotional control also relates to the way our prefrontal cortex works. So the thing about executive functions is very rarely are they working in isolation. And we're going to look at all the different skills in a lot more depth in a minute. But what you need to know is it's not like there are like lots of kind of, if you think of it a bit like a chest of drawers, like different kind of neural pathways, all different drawers in the prefrontal cortex, and 1 minute you're using your emotional control and then 1 minute you're using your cognitive flexibility. At any one time, life is messy, having to use lots of the skills at the same time. So to give you an example, a live example right now, while I'm doing this presentation, I'm having to manage my cognitive flexibility. So I'm having to switch from one task to another. I'm having to use my emotional control and not let my emotions get in the way of me perhaps feeling a bit stressed because there are 59 people watching this webinar and my computer has crashed, but also my working memory. And we're going to look at what working memory is in more depth, but it's basically the ability to hold information in mind and process it. So if I was to pick one of you now as a volunteer, don't worry, I'm not going to do this. We're not going to zoom in on your face and I'm going to ask you to speak. But if I was to do that and give you a phone number and ask you to repeat that number back to me, you would have to hold it in mind while you were saying it back to me. But it's not the same as short-term memory. You're not going to remember it in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or even the next day. So while I am also trying to speak and at the same time trying to access my PowerPoint presentation, what I'm also having to do is I'm having to hold in mind, okay, where's the file? And actually, so I'm going to share my screen again now. I think a computer is a really useful way to think about this, because if you think about it, our desktop is all the things that we have open, all the tabs we have open in our brain. It's the things that we are working on. That's our working memory. But our long-term memory is the stuff that is saved elsewhere. So what you just witnessed there was a live action demonstration of me using my emotional control, cognitive flexibility, and working memory to carry on with the presentation. I'm not going to try and play that video because my concern is it's going to do the same thing again. But what we will do is we will link to it. I'm saying that we can do this. I'm sure there is capacity to do this on the Bell House website, or we will email you all in case you want to watch the neural pathway so you can see it there. See it happening in live time, but I'm afraid you're just going to have to imagine it for now. So let's just take a look at this graph. So remember, so I'm asking you to use your working memory now, because I went off piste with the talk and I started talking about, I was asking you to hold in mind without giving you any kind of visual aids to help your working memory. I was asking you to process some pretty difficult concepts. I was talking about cognitive flexibility and emotional control and working memory. I want to bring you back now to neuroplasticity. So the key message is, and I have to warn you, this can come across as a bit depressing for a number of reasons. You may be more mature and you were hoping to learn a new skill. You absolutely can. Neuroplasticity does not tell us that it is impossible to learn things. In fact, the brain is plastic well into an old age. But what this graph shows us, if we look at the blue line to begin with, what we can see is that the brain's ability to change in response to experience declines over time. So the older we get, the less sponge-like, the less moldable our brains are. And the amount of effort, so that's what the green line shows, the amount of effort to make changes, it increases over time. So basically it gets harder to learn new stuff. So if you want to learn a new language, for example, and you are more senior, it is not impossible, but you are going to find it more challenging than a child who has a far more plastic, sponge-like brain. However, it is more complicated than that, because what we also know is that when we are learning new things, we're often relying on well-trodden neural pathways from, way before. So to give you an anecdote, when I was about 17, 18, I went to a new college, and it was also an adult education college. As well as teenagers, there were adults as well. And in my Spanish A-level class, I made friends with Anne, who was 63, and she was also doing Spanish A-level as well. Now, I was far more able to pick things up pretty quickly from just listening, or I used to hang out with a lot of Spanish exchange students. I basically did not seemingly have to put nearly as much effort in as she did to pick up the language. But what she was very good at was studying. So she had learned how to learn. She was building on some well-trodden neural pathways that had taught her, right, this is the best, most effective way for you to learn things like grammar. So she was much better, for example, in exams than me. She'd also spoke French and Latin, and there was connections between Spanish and French and Latin. So she was able, when we were doing a comprehension exercise, to go, oh, actually, that sounds very similar to another word that I know in Spanish or Latin. So what I think this anecdote really shows is that, yes, it does require more effort, but that's a bit simplistic, because what we need to realize is that older people are also going to be building on other neural pathways that they have learned earlier on in life. The other thing which I can think is a bit misleading is you might look at this graph, and the blue line in particular, and go, right, well, I've got a 15-year-old and that's it. I've missed the window of opportunity. Look at that, it's a steep decline. Now, it is a steep decline, but that's partly because in the first few years of life, I described to you my son learning to walk. Every single day in the early years, children are learning new things. Like, there are so many new experiences. So of course they are forming so many new neural pathways. And also we know in the early years, they form these at a faster rate. However, the prefrontal cortex, which is what we're going to be focusing on, doesn't stop, isn't fully mature until the mid-20s. So if you are working even with an older teenager, or you are a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old and you struggle with some of these things, your brain is not even fully mature yet. Okay, the singing has started. This is my son going to sleep. If it is distracting, please could somebody, perhaps one of the volunteers, could just let me know, and I will put my call center headphones on. But let's see how we go. So the developmental timetable in the brain. So the brain is not just a blank slate, it's a complex interplay of genes and environment. And what that means is that you might be predisposed to be kind of naturally talented at something, but if you don't have the right environmental input, you're not necessarily going to become as good, for example, as someone that does not have natural talent, but has had a lot of support or lessons, if you think about learning music or something like that. And our ability to learn different skills at different ages is not equal. So there are particular developmental windows of opportunity when the brain is highly responsive to specific environmental input. So let's take the prefrontal cortex, for example. Childhood, even early 20s, teen years, that is a developmental window of opportunity. And the brain develops broadly from back to front. Now remember, we're focused on the prefrontal cortex in this talk. So the front is one of the last parts of the brain to develop. And I've already spoken about this, but the brain regions connected to executive function skills go on developing well into late adolescence. So hopefully you've held it in your working memory, that definition of executive functioning, but in case you haven't, just take a little look at it again there. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about how the prefrontal cortex works with other parts of the brain, because it is not that it works in isolation. Remember, we spoke about the complex networks in the brain, and in many ways I think it's useful to think of it in terms of an inner dialogue. So the prefrontal cortex is kind of having conversations with other parts of the brain. So let's just take, for example, you need to get something done. You've had a task that you have been needing to work on for a really long time, that you've been putting off and that you have been procrastinating. The prefrontal cortex is going to be working in tandem with other parts of the brain. For example, the part of the brain which is perhaps associated with your emotional reaction to things, or your reward center. Perhaps you don't find this a very rewarding part of the brain, but also other parts of our brain to do with thought and reflection. So metacognition is the part of the brain that enables us, to keep going with the bird analogy, to have a bird's eye view, to take a step back, and as we are acting, to be able to reflect on, oh, how am I handling this situation? Could I be handling it differently? Am I doing a good job? And metacognition is a core aspect of executive functioning, but it's also associated with other parts of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is in conversation. Now, some of you might recognize this image. It is from a film called Inside Out, and I think this is a great film to go away and watch, whether you have children or not. It's made by Pixar, and what you are looking at here is you are looking at different characters that represent different emotions, and this is inside a little girl's brain, and it really brings to life through these different characters how at any one point we are kind of bringing to bear, it kind of personifies what these different feelings are. So I think you're looking at, I can't actually remember all their names now, but maybe joy we're looking at right there. And I think that's also a useful way for thinking about executive function skills. So depending on what the situation is, you can almost think of it like an air traffic control system just above our eyes. We have to work out, what do I need to bring to this situation? Do I need to bring, for example, my sustained attention to the situation? Or do I need to be able to move quickly, to use my cognitive flexibility to switch from one situation to another? Now, one of the common sort of models for thinking about how the prefrontal cortex works was developed and theorized by somebody called Miyake in this paper in 2000 called the Unity and Diversity model. And he thought about our executive function skills in terms of there being three domains. So there's working memory. Remember, I spoke about that earlier. I gave you the phone number example. If I give you a phone number and I ask you to say it back to me, working memory also entails us relying on rules that we have learned in the past. So my son, for example, at the moment is learning peekaboo, the game peekaboo. Now, a key part of peekaboo is that you are anticipating. He knows the rules, he knows the game, he knows, oh, what that person does next is they jump out from behind the door. So working memory relies on us holding that in our mind and rely on us using rules. And then we have shifting, so cognitively shifting from one situation or one task to another, and then our ability to inhibit our responses. Now, within those domains, it is then more complex, and we're going to look at a list of skills that we work with, and we're working with young people in a minute. But I wanted to mention that to you in case you want to go away, do some more research yourself. Now, since I have actually done this talk, and it slightly throws a spanner in the works of the neatness of my talk, I was telling some of the people at Bell House about this as I was preparing this talk earlier. And there has been a paper that has recently come out, which has basically said, and I'm very happy to share it if people are interested, that perhaps it's not that useful us thinking about these skills as being kind of separate domains in our prefrontal cortex, because actually, you know, as I said in the slide before, at any one point we are using these skills in service of a goal that we want to achieve, and we're having to use other parts of our brain as well. And it's also connected to things like our culture and our values. So what that means is that a person will use their executive function skills, if you look at those domains, in a different way, in different cultures, or depending on whether a situation is rewarding or motivating for them. So basically, these things are context dependent. They are not fixed. It is not like you have a fix, so they change over time, so they're malleable over time, and that's what I was talking about with neuroplasticity. But also, depending on the situation you are in, you are going to be able to use your working memory or your shifting or your response inhibition more effectively or not. If you are looking for some videos because you want to share this with your children, or you want to share this professionally with young people that you work with, I really recommend these videos called The Adventures of You, which have been created by the Australian government slightly randomly, and they've taken the information that we know about executive function skills to help young people think about how they can take control of their prefrontal cortex to support them, you know, we were talking about in service of a goal, to support them to reach the career that they want to reach. So do go away and take a look at that. It's called The Adventures of You if you are interested. So let's now look at a list of practical skills that we need to use in order to be able to get by in life that are associated with the prefrontal cortex. Now, there is great debate within the academic community about whether there are 3 domains, like the example, the model I just gave you, or whether there is more domains. But in terms of practically applying these in our life, because that's what we're interested in our work, how do we actually not just theorize and research, and why that is really integral, but how do we help people who struggle with some of these things? And this is a model that we use, which is 11 skills to help us think about how do we get better at this stuff in life, and how am I struggling, and what impact would it have on my life if I could manage these things and have better strategies. So the first is response inhibition. So that is the ability to not just say the first thing that comes into your head. So the person that's going to struggle with that is perhaps going to offend people. It's the person perhaps who might struggle with, for example, if you are trying to give up smoking or drinking, you might you might have that goal, but you can't just kind of help but kind of give in to your desire. Working memory, I think we've gone over that a lot. Emotional control, and I think emotional control is one that we are all very familiar with. Sustained attention, task initiation, so the ability to get going on tasks, and it is real. Some people find this much harder than others because of the architecture of their brain. Planning and prioritizing, organization, time management, goal-directed persistence, of being able to keep going in the face of adversity and not kind of getting going off track or off piste. Cognitive flexibility, and I spoke about that earlier when I was modeling that, I hope well, with my trying to get back on track with the presentation. And then metacognition, the ability to take a step back and reflect on our own behavior. So when do we expect these different skills to come online? So remember I said that our brains are not fully developed until our mid-20s. We do expect though, so some of these skills, we start to see them. It doesn't mean that they're fully mature though, but we start to see them come online at different stages. Now, you can see in infancy, we expect some degree of attentional control. Preschool and early childhood, we start to see a bit more emotional control, development of self-talk, flexibility. Late childhood, early adolescence, working memory, cognitive flexibility. But it's not until adolescence and young adulthood that we expect planning, self-monitoring and problem solving to become more present. Now, this study is looking at big numbers, and it's looking at averages. It's not even looking at people that are neurodiverse, right? So that's something really important for us to take into account. And we're going to think about neurodiversity and executive function skills in a minute. Now, the thing that I also just really wanted to draw out here, that given that we know that self-monitoring, problem solving doesn't even come online until young adulthood and adolescence, and it's not mature until our mid-20s, I just want you to consider for a moment what that means for things like our legal system. We are putting young people in prison, for example, at 18, based on decisions that they make, which are perhaps not always the best decisions. But developmentally, they're not even there yet in terms of being fully mature, in terms of their cognitive ability to self-monitor and problem solve. So I want you just to take a moment to reflect on yourself. And I want you just to ask yourself, so I'm going to go back to that list. On that list, which of the skills which you have found particularly challenging in life, and what impact has that had on your life? So let's go back to it now. So just take a look at that list. Now, if you are interested in digging into this in a bit more depth, we can send around a questionnaire and you can assess yourself. This is not a formal assessment that would lead to diagnosis of anything, but it will give you a benchmark for the things that you find more challenging and more difficult. Now, the reason that I get you to do this is because I really want you to make the connection that the way our prefrontal cortex operates has a really real impact on our lives and our ability to live the lives that we want to live. And to give you an example of how this plays out, for example, in academic work, we often think, the things that we ask of children, we think they're fairly straightforward, but actually they are executive function skill minefields. Take self-assessment. So we ask kids to write down, how do you think you did? You've got to be able to be very metacognitive, use your working memory. Now, we ask primary school children to do this, yet we know actually developmentally it's something that it's a long time before they're going to be fully there yet with metacognition. Or essay writing. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was at school, I would often, the feedback I would get was, she's not answering the question. And I would think, but I wrote so much, and I definitely wrote around the topic. Now, I think often we might diagnose a person who's struggling with essay writing as like, their thoughts are all over the place, or they're disorganized in their thinking, or they're not focused. But actually, I've come to realize it's got a lot to do with our working memory, because in order to be able to answer an essay question well, you've got to be holding the question in mind the whole way through as you're going through and answering. Or to debate well, you've got to be able to hold that in mind. So I think often we misunderstand what children's problems are. So we think that somebody's disinterested, but actually, or they're not motivated, or they're struggling with attention, but in fact it could be something very different. Well, now let's just look at behavioural expectations of children. So something as simple as sitting in a still class requires response inhibition, emotional control, sustained attention. Or following instructions from a teacher, working memory, task initiation, response inhibition. Now, to give you an example of how I think we might misunderstand a child in relation to what's going on when they don't follow instructions, if we say to a child, right, now bearing in mind, the research tells us, just to break out of character for a moment, we know our working memories can comfortably hold about 5 bits of information, but children are not going to be able to hold as many. If a teacher says, 1, I want you to go over to your tray. 2, I want you to get your maths book. 3, I want you to sit back on the mat. 4, I want you to turn to the next person next to you. 5, I want you to turn to page 6 and answer the questions. There were 7 instructions there. Now, I was saying, numbering them, but often teachers would just reel that off very quickly. Now, what options are open to a child that has working memory challenges who perhaps didn't follow all the instructions? Either they might put their hand up and say, can you tell me again? And the teacher might turn around and say, you should have been listening. Maybe they'll turn to the person next to them and ask them, but then the teacher might turn around and say, get on with the task, you're not supposed to be speaking to somebody else. Or they might be embarrassed and they just act the fool and they start joking around. But you can definitely see how that child might be misunderstood as not caring, not wanting to engage, purposefully not following, but actually there is an executive function skill challenge that they're struggling with. So why bother paying attention to executive function skills? So they can predict academic achievement and later life outcomes. Our education system is not just testing knowledge, it indirectly tests how good students are at these skills. Now, at the foundation, we are particularly focused on thinking about this in relation to young people, but I would also argue it's the same in the workplaces as well. So I have friends, for example, who work in HR and human resources who say, God, I get so frustrated, I've got someone who's utterly brilliant, they've got amazing ideas, but they just are not able to adhere to these really simple processes. And I've tried to put support in place and it's not working. So actually, I really think not just within education, but it'd be really useful within the workplace. There was more understanding that some people find these things more challenging than others, and we need to put strategies in place in order to be able to support those that do not find them as straightforward. And the world in which we live today, where we are bombarded with so much information, even those of you that are genetically predisposed to have very good executive function skills, will be far more under pressure just in terms of the number of environmental and informational inputs that we are having to process at any one time, which is so different to even 10 years ago. If you think about the number of emails that we receive, the way we're constantly having to shift from one thing to another. Sorry. So these are skills for life. They're essential for attaining goals at school and beyond. And finally, poor executive functioning is comorbid with mental health challenges. So the research shows us that you tend to see these 2 things co-occurring. So people that struggle with executive function skills seem to also struggle with poor mental health, and vice versa. Now, it's a bit of a chicken or egg situation here, because what we don't know is that, is it something about the architecture of the brain that means that if, for example, you struggle with sustained attention or response inhibition, then you're also likely to struggle with having difficult thoughts and be able to suppress your thoughts, and you might get anxious? Or is it that we value executive function skills in our society so much that if you struggle with things like time management, planning and prioritizing, sustained attention, you grow up having people around you go, you're lazy, or you're not good enough, or you're not committed, or you don't care. And at some point that starts to have a really negative impact on your mental health. My sense is it's probably a bit of both, but it's very difficult to parcel this out in the research. Okay, so I've already touched on this, but executive function skills are context dependent. So we know the research is clear that they improve with familiarity and comfort, experience and interest, sleep and nutrition, and they decline when we experience frustration, stress, disengagement, loss of control, and even fatigue, hunger, thirst, and illness. And there are individual differences, enormous individual differences between how different people's brains develop. Some brains are impacted on by genetic factors, but poverty and stress has an impact, but also they are the hallmark of many neurodevelopmental disorders or conditions. So ASD, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and I feel like disorder is not a very good word there, I apologise, in terms of celebrating neurodiversity. So, because actually, and I see this just to share a bit about my own life, my husband has ADHD, and absolutely some of these things are very challenging for him. But the flip side of some of these things, so for example, the fact that he does struggle with response inhibition, I think is also the source of his incredible creativity, because he doesn't necessarily have thoughts popping up that go, oh, that's not a very good idea, or should I be doing it that way? He's able to get kind of more into a flow state. So it is not as straightforward, I always think, as executive function skills are good or bad. But the challenge is that in the world in which we are live in, we are expected to have some degree of competency with them to get by in order to be able to manage the normal expectations of life. So there we are. That just gives you a flavour of some of these things. And for those children that are more neurodiverse, specific training in strategies to develop skills can be really essential in terms of helping them flourish in academically in terms of their well-being. So I'm just looking at the time now, and I want to make sure that we get enough time to answer the questions. So I'm just going to leave, or I'm going to finish on this note. So I do not want you to take away from this talk that executive function deficits are specific to people with just a diagnosis. We are all on a spectrum. We will all have some strengths and some weaknesses, and on a day-to-day basis, in fact, a minute-to-minute basis, our ability to use these skills will be changing due to things like thirst, hunger, whether we enjoy something. There's a whole field which I do not have time to go in today, which also looks at when our experience is rewarding and interesting for us, how it's far easier to use our executive function skills. So that might explain, for example, why you find it easier to sustain your attention on something, on a television program, for example, but not on that email that you have been putting off answering, or the paperwork that you've been answering. Or perhaps if you've got children, you might be thinking, wait a minute, how come my child can focus for ages on a computer game but not on their homework? And there are reasons why that are rooted in the way that the brain works, that means that context impacts on our executive function skills. So I can see that there are lots of questions, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to one of our volunteers who is going to help us work our way through the questions. But I hope that was informative and it wasn't too disruptive, the various technical issues, and if anything, they served to show you in action how executive function skills work or don't always work.
Well, Imogen, just before William takes over for the questions, I just want to say there's been quite lots of positive feedback on the chat already. But, I mean, I personally have found it really interesting, and you've made it very clear how important it is actually to develop that executive functioning particularly during childhood and adolescence, and how important it is then for life skills later on, and that so many fail when they don't have a good grounding, good foundation. So thank you so much. I'll hand you over to William though.
Right, my pleasure. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Hi, great. Thank you very much for that, Imogen. That was really interesting. So I'm going to help you just pick out some questions from the chat, starting with one from Caro C. She asked a question during your presentation, and it says, can you suggest some specific strategies for improving executive functions for KS2?
Right. So I'm just trying to think of the best way to answer this, because it is huge, and I feel like it would be useful to share some specific resources with everyone who want to explore this in more depth. Now, the reason that I am not going to go into a lot of depth now about particular executive function skill strategies is a couple of reasons. So the first is, as I said, it's massive, and I think there would be lots that you could go away and look at. But also, one of the ways that we work when we are training teachers is that we do not jump in and say, right, here is a list of off-the-shelf executive function strategies that you can go away and implement with a child that has sustained attention issues. Now, the reason that we don't do that is because if we think back to neuroplasticity, we want children to be going through the process of establishing what executive function skill do I struggle with, and what strategy can I put in place that works for me? Because if we give them the opportunity to think through that themselves, then they are developing the neural pathways that mean that they are going to be able to do that when you're always not there. You're not always going to be there over their shoulder to go, oh, I think you're struggling with sustained attention right now, and this is the strategy that you need to use. So that's the first reason that we don't do that, okay? We want them. Now, we do prompt if they're really struggling and they absolutely can't come up with any ideas, and I can point you in the direction of different skills. However, the magic really is in getting children to think through, what am I struggling with here, and how might I approach it differently? Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, how can a child possibly do that? But I can tell you now that I have seen children that are 6 years old, and obviously it needs to be within a classroom where there has been conversations about what these skills are and how we use them and how we don't use them, who is able to go, oh, I think I'm finding this hard right now, and I think this is what I need to do. And the model that we use is a model called activated learning, which was developed by a psychologist called Laurie Faith. He was a teacher for 17 years in Canada, in Toronto. And part of my doctorate has been evaluating what is the impact when teachers work in this way with children. And we get them to do it on a classroom level, because obviously a teacher with 20, 30 students cannot get down on these for every single child and say, what executive function skill do you think you're struggling with? How might you approach this? So we do it on a classroom level. However, there are, of course, particular strategies that you can draw attention to for students and then get them to think through what works for them. And that leads to my second point. What works for one person is not necessarily going to be the thing that works for somebody else. So, for example, let me just think about something that I particularly struggle with. So when I'm feeling overwhelmed, for example, I just need to get everything out on a bit of paper, and I need to kind of do a mind map, and then I need to look at it and see it like that, and then I can start to plan and prioritize, right? And go, right, what's important? What do I need to tackle first? But for somebody else, some of you might be hearing that and going, oh my gosh, that would absolutely not work for me. If I did a mind map like that, I would feel totally overwhelmed. So it is also about establishing what works for different people and equipping children with the ability to reflect like that. Now, that was a bit of a politician's answer. I don't want the person who asked that to feel like I didn't get anything out of that. So I'm very happy to point you in the direction of more specific resources, but I hope I've made it clear there are good reasons in terms of developing children's neural pathways to be more metacognitive, that we don't always give off-the-shelf strategies.
Great. Phoebe asks, in what way can neglect during childhood affect executive functions?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good point. And we, in the research literature, you will often see them referred to as ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. And absolutely, trauma and neglect does impact on the development of the prefrontal cortex. Now, it is really complex to be able to work out, which particular executive function skill, because the nature of trauma and neglect is that it is going to impact people in different ways, and that the nature of the trauma and the neglect is different for different people. But we certainly know that it does impede the development of the prefrontal cortex. Again, I'm really happy in my follow-up to point you in the right direction to take a look at that. But I was saying that it's a combination of genes and environment. It's very difficult sometimes to separate out what would have happened anyway in terms of somebody's genes, but then what the specific impact has been of their environment. But it's bad news, basically, in essence, in general. That being said, as a more positive message, if you are working with children that have experienced trauma or neglect, yes, we might anticipate that there could be negative impacts on the development of the prefrontal cortex. But I hope the message of neuroplasticity and malleability is that yes, that can set up a person to find these things difficult, but they can be worked on with the right support. And the way that we go about doing that is, first of all, helping children understand what executive function skills are. The best step you can take is to be modeling that as an adult, because before you can introduce any strategies, somebody needs to understand how these things play out, when in life are we having to use them. In the same way I was describing to you as I was struggling, this is what's going on. You can start to explain that to children. And I think often these terms, sometimes people say to me, why will we label these things? Aren't there enough labels out there already? Isn't it confusing? But these skills already get labeled. Let's take a child that experienced trauma or neglect. They might be told, you're impulsive, or you've got an attitude problem, or you've got an anger problem. But instead of calling it those things, if we call them by what they actually are, which is response inhibition or metacognition, that takes the emotional sting out of it, but it also helps the child to start to understand and make the connection between what the skill is and what the behavior is. And then we can start to think about how might you respond differently in the future.
Another question here from Alexandra, asking if you could repeat what you mean by neurodiverse.
Yeah, so we see, so in relation to that particular slide, I was talking about it in terms of people that have a neurodevelopmental condition or a diagnosis of something like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. Now, there's a big debate and a movement to not think of those things through a deficit lens. So instead to think about it rather that those people's brains are wired differently. Now that will mean that because the way society is set up and geared towards catering for the masses, right? And maybe the masses have historically been those that do not struggle with executive function skills or do not have a diagnosis. But that does not mean that those that do struggle with executive function skills are, in some way, there is something wrong with them. In fact, their brains are perhaps wired differently and they find some things harder than others, but often to flip it, and that was the example I was giving with my husband, that can also be the source of some of their strengths and their creativity. So you could have, I heard a great, I went to the ADHD Foundation conference recently, and there's an amazing guy called Ed Hallowell, who's a great speaker. I really recommend checking him out. And to flip ADHD on its head, he said, actually, those of you that don't have ADHD, he has ADHD, you have attention surplus disorder. And I thought that was a great way of thinking about it, because you can totally see how sometimes your prefrontal cortex could be working overtime to the point where you're so focused on something that you don't see other things around you. Or let's just say you're at a concert and you are trying to just enjoy the music, but actually your planning brain can't, you can't turn it off. You're thinking about, right, when's the last train that I need to get home? When have I got to leave? Okay, I've still got half an hour, but do I need to be getting ready? So someone who's excellent at time management might find that they then find it really hard to be in the moment and just enjoy the music. So that's what I meant in terms of thinking about how people who are neurodiverse are not necessarily not just thinking it through a deficit lens, but neurodiverse in essence basically means we are not all neurologically the same, and that there are some people that do not tend to fit the typical mold in terms of the way most people's brains are wired, but that's also something, a cause for celebration. There we go.
Great. David is asking, I think, how does childhood trauma affect or develop neuroplasticity?
So it doesn't. So plasticity is a neutral thing. It's not going to be impede. It can also so what am I trying to say? It can be used. Neuroplasticity can take place when we are trying to learn new things, but also it can work the other way as well. So the question was specifically about trauma. It's going to impede plasticity. For example, let's just say a child has had a lot of neglect and has not received much love. That then is going to mean that their child is not developing neural pathways associated with attachment and love. However, it doesn't necessarily slow down the rate of plasticity, because what might be happening is that they are then developing lots of neural pathways in relation to things like fear. So it is not a good or bad thing, neuroplasticity. It's a process that happens, and depending on the environmental input, you are going to develop pathways that reflect the sorts of experiences that you've had. So to give you a really tangible example, and I really recommend going away and looking at these images, there was some brain scans that were done in the 90s, I think, of children that had grown up in Romanian orphanages where they had not received much care and love. Now, what they found was that the brains of children that had grown up in these orphanages were much smaller than children who had grown up with safe and secure environments. So overall, and this unfortunately continued even after they had been adopted into loving families, their brains, there was not as much matter basically. So it's not that plasticity had slowed down, it's just there wasn't as much environmental input, so their brains were smaller. But unfortunately, the parts of the brain associated with the trauma, you will end up having stronger neural pathways associated with the trauma. So the more you think of thought, the more you repeat an action, and it can also be something bad, the stronger the neural pathways will become in relation to that thought or experience, which is why it's so hard if you have experienced trauma, or you have, maybe sometimes you have it where you have these stories that you tell yourself, or certain negative thoughts. They're really hard to get rid of because they are so well trodden, those paths. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and we have one from Darren here asking, what is the difference between response inhibition and emotional control?
What is the difference between the two?
Yes.
So there's a very famous test within psychology called the Stroop test. By the way, I just want to say, for those of you that ask questions and they haven't been answered, I was going to attempt to answer them and follow up. However, I might regret that when I see that there is if there is like 25 questions. So what I might have to do is look for key themes and group them together, and then we're happy to email around general answers. But between working and having a 1-year-old, I might not be able to provide in-depth research referenced answers to all the other 25 questions. But they may be comments, and I haven't looked. But anyway, to come back to the question, what is the difference between response inhibition and emotional control? So the two are often going to be working in tandem. But you sometimes are going to have to be using your response inhibition but there is not necessarily a particularly emotive response that is impacting on your response inhibition. Now, this is the tough thing about measuring how executive function skills play out in everyday life, because it's really hard to recreate in the laboratory or in a lab it's like what real life is like. So let's take a classic test of response inhibition. So it's something called the Stroop test, where you have different words will flash up on your screen and they describe colours. So for example, it will be red, the word yellow, the word blue, and the font will sometimes be in the same colour as the word describes. So it could be the word red, and sometimes it will be in red writing, and sometimes it will be the word red and it would be in yellow writing. Now, I could say to you, okay, I only want you to press on this button when it's congruent. So the word red is in red writing. If it's red, but it says red, but it's in yellow writing, do not push the button. Now, in that moment, I am able to more purely measure your response inhibition. But sometimes things like your stress levels, for example, might impact on how well you perform in that test. So somebody else might arrive in that and be like very relaxed. They do not feel whether the outcome on how they do on the Stroop test is integral to them as a person. And by the way, I didn't even mention this, executive function skills are not connected to your IQ. So you can have a very high IQ but struggle with executive function skills. But somebody else might walk into that test and think, God, if I do really badly in this test, that's going to say a lot about me. So I've got to do well. So they're feeling incredibly stressed, and then that impacts on their response inhibition. But for somebody else, they might be able to stay completely calm. Their emotions are not influencing their response inhibition. So the way they are then carrying out that test is more just a measure of their response inhibition. And that's one of the things that's really difficult when we're trying to assess people's cognitive functioning, because different people are going to be bringing different things to different situations. When we do educational assessments of children, for example, when we try to assess their cognitive functioning in order to make a diagnosis, that's one of the things that's tough, because depending on how much that child has had to eat that day, on how they're feeling emotionally, whether they had an argument with their parent, that might impact on their ability, on their response inhibition in that test. Now, just to finish on that, remember I had that list of 11 skills. I don't want you to think of it as like, I think of it as like a chest of drawers that depend on some situations. You open one drawer and you use your response inhibition, and then another one you use in working memory. The reality is they are often all being used interchangeably. And that was kind of the point of, I told you there's this new article that's just come out that's thrown some of this stuff into question. And for a long time in psychology and neuroscience, we have thought about them as kind of domain-specific skills, separated things. And this person saying, it's more complicated than that. Do you remember I spoke, I talked about how the neural pathways, and that was 10,000 connections for each one. The prefrontal cortex is going to be working with all these different neural pathways at any one moment. So you might be going, well, what's the point then of that mod? What was the point of you telling me about these 11 skills? This is human beings' attempt to bring some order and understanding to the way that the brain works in service of being able to support people who seem to have certain patterns of behavior which we describe as executive function skills. It's a lot, isn't it? Quite late on a Wednesday night. Sorry, I hope your brain's hurting too much. My brain's hurting just even saying that. It's a model, it's a way for us to understand how the brain works. Sorry, William, over to you again.
No, it's been very good and very interesting. Thank you very much for your time and your talk. It was very good.
My pleasure. Thank you. And I'm going to just copy and paste all of these comments so that I can work my way through them, goodness knows when, some point, to answer any questions that were not answered more fully in the talk. So
and I guess also Connections in Mind is really is the place to find you.
Yes, so I run our charity. So there's Connections in Mind, the company, but I run our charity that works to try and promote this message and with families that face multiple disadvantages. But absolutely get the Connections in Mind Foundation. If you Google that, please do get in touch with us.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. It's been a great turnout as well. It's always a bit weird talking into talking into people you can't see, but I hope you feel like I could see a few faces and a few nodding heads, and I was grateful for those. I hope it was interesting for everyone.
Definitely.
Well, that's nice. I'm just reading all the comments now.
Yeah, masses of very interesting comments, actually.
I think you might also be able to save the all the comments in chat to your computer.
Oh, perfect. Great. File. Yeah, let me do that.
Although you'll have to scroll through quite a few thank you messages.
That's fine. For my ego.
Yeah. So we got another one from Sophie. Yeah, so I think if you press the file option on the chat, you'll be able to save it to whatever storage you'll like.
Okay, brilliant. Can you do that too, please, William? Because I'm struggling a bit. I don't know why it's not letting me do it. Keep saying Google Drive.
Well, you know what? I can just copy and paste the whole chat and then email it to you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Yeah.
I think, Imogen, it might be saved
Another time
with the recording.
Okay.
Yes, so I've recorded this.
Okay, great. You can have me on camera panicking about my computer crashing.
I'm going to stop recording now.